What up, folks? We're back. Another week of learning on your couch. Seems like we're going to be here for a while. Hope you're getting used to it. Just a couple quick thank yous to everybody who is submitting all of your work in Google Classroom. And if you're not, you are asking me about it. You're shooting me emails, and everybody's doing a really great job thus far. And I just wanted to kind of start today off by saying thanks to everybody. And that, as always, hope you're doing well. Hope everybody is safe and sane and ready to quit talking about imperialism and hopefully ready to start talking about World War I. So if you're following along with this PowerPoint, great. A couple things that I would be doing while we're talking today about World War I. I would have the PowerPoint open, or follow along with the video, whatever. And I would also have that timeline that I attached, because World War I is kind of crazy and kind of confusing as it starts, but I think you guys will wrap your head around it pretty quickly. So again, I'd have this PowerPoint open, but I'd also have that timeline specifically for part 2 of the video. I guess you might not need the timeline until part 2, but the note guide that goes along with this, if you'll notice, it's basically just got these letters, M.A.I.N, down a sheet of paper, kind of like, I think that's called an acrostic poem, I don't know. But it's, basically, I just want you to kind of jot along some notes as we go for each of these 4 main causes. Luckily, it's both the word main and kind of an acronym, acrostic, I don't know, I just work here. But go ahead and make sure that you've got the note guide opened as well, and we'll go ahead and get started. Alright, so jumping in, the main causes of World War I. If you know anything about World War I, you'll know that it's obviously the First World War. They weren't really planning on having a second one. At the time, they did not call it World War I because of that. They just called it the Great War. Nobody really thought that we were ever going to have a war like this on this scale, but we did. And the United States really was not too terribly involved until the later chunk of the war. It is mainly a European conflict, and until we get involved, now this map is probably a little confusing to you right this second, but it'll get less confusing as we go, I promise. One thing I don't love about the map is the fact that they used 2 different colors of green, or it's like a Kelly green and then like a baby puke green. I don't know what maybe a brown, I have no idea. But it's not my favorite green. Anyway, I'm probably going to refer back to this map a couple times throughout this part 1 of the video. So if I'm telling you to look at the map, this is the map that I'm talking about, okay? Anyway, it's called the Great War. World War I has 4 big causes that kind of get it going. Obviously, they are the ones listed here: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And again, as you've got the... I'm going to stick with the word acronym. I feel like acronym is the right word. As you've got the acronym down the side of that note guide, as we go through each of these, just jot down a couple notes that you feel like are helpful about each cause of World War I, and it'll make a little bit more sense to you as we go. So, militarism, if you think about it, think about the last 50 years that we've talked about in not just U.S. history, but world history in general. Think about all of the inventions that people had. Think about all of the industrial revolutions that have been going on all over the world. Think of the assembly line. Think of all of the work that we've talked about people were doing. Machines and innovations in technology basically allowed countries, not just in the United States, but all over the world, allowed countries to build up a big military even during times of peace. This really didn't happen prior to World War I. This is something that is pretty signature to the Industrial Revolution. It gives countries a really big supply of guns, big supply of other weapons, other sort of military technologies and vehicles and things like that. Not to mention the Wright brothers in the early 1900s, I want to say 1903 or 04, you might have to check me on that. They have their airplane in its infancy. And by the time that World War I rolls around, we have, and I say we, the United States, and pretty much every other country involved, has a giant military. I'm going to use the word giant with air quotes around it, but a much larger military than they've ever had before. And we get what's called an arms race, which is basically a race by every single country to have the biggest, most powerful military in the world. And you can see on this next slide, the years leading up to World War I. It starts in 1914, so this is the 5 years prior to World War I. This is every country and the amount of money that they're spending each year, and you can see that it's growing every single year up until we get to World War I's beginning in 1914. So every single country is spending all kinds of money on their military. And just think about that. We spend a lot of money on our military today. Think about why a country would be, at this time, basically stockpiling. Why they'd be stockpiling weapons, equipment, getting troops ready, training them. We're going to see in the 1900s, the 20th century, we're going to see a really large shift toward nations stockpiling military arms. So you can imagine, you can't fight a war without guns, obviously. At least in the 20th century, you can't. So these guys, all of these countries involved here, are going to be stockpiling weapons and spending a lot of money before the war even starts. And that's really our first big cause there, is militarism. Now, the second one is alliances. This is going to be kind of confusing. I guess it's not really that confusing. The only confusing part is that the Triple Alliance is the Central Powers, and the Triple Entente, that's how you pronounce that word. A lot of people think it's like Entente or Entente. It's not. It's Entente. I even gave you a little pronunciation help in the note guide. But the Triple Alliance forms what are known as the Central Powers, and the Triple Entente forms what are known as the Allied Powers. All right, and you can see on your note guide, I've actually given you some space to jot these countries down. What I would notice here, with regard to who's on whose side, is that there's 3 big ones on each side, and then a couple little outliers. So the Triple Alliance here, making the Central Powers, the big players you've got are Germany, Austria-Hungary. That's one place, by the way, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Anytime you hear me say Austria-Hungary or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I'm talking about the same place. And then lastly, the Ottoman Empire. Okay, let's not forget Italy. Italy's there. But if you'll notice in parentheses, they are a part of the Central Powers before 1915. And then after 1915, they switch their jerseys inside out and go and play for the other team, for the Allied Powers. We'll get to that a little later. While the Triple Entente, your big players are Britain, France, Russia, eventually the United States. The United States is going to come into the war pretty much as Russia is leaving. And then Serbia. You're probably like, bro, where's Serbia? I've never heard of that before. Refer to that map that I gave you. Serbia is going to be pretty important in just a couple minutes. That's just an illustration of the Triple Alliance that forms the Central Powers. Okay, our third big cause of World War I is imperialism, and luckily for you, you just spent an entire unit knowing exactly what imperialism is. So imagine that not just the United States is trying to imperialize, but imagine that the whole world is trying to imperialize, because that's exactly what they're doing. Each country, especially really, really big countries, are trying to exercise their control over smaller, less powerful countries all over the world. Okay, so if you can remember the United States, we are trying to exercise our control in parts of the world like Latin America. We're messing around in Cuba. We're annexing a territory like Hawaii. We're buying territories like Alaska. We're trying to grow the United States as much as we can. Nations all over the place are trying to do the same thing. All right, but in Europe, this is going to create some tension, and we're going to get to that in just a minute, what tension there actually is. Specifically, there's some tension between France and Germany, and there has been since a few decades prior, since 1871. This territory here, it's called Alsace-Lorraine. Again, this is another name that people sort of mispronounce frequently, but it's pronounced Alsace-Lorraine. Okay, and if you're like, dude, I don't know where that is, it's actually on the next slide here on this little map. This yellow territory here is Alsace-Lorraine. So you'll notice that France is down here and Germany's up here, but in the middle there, that yellow territory, right on the border with Germany and Belgium, that is the territory known as Alsace-Lorraine. And there was tension for Alsace-Lorraine since 1871 because historically Germany and France have kind of fought back and forth. Imagine like several decades long, like a volleyball match between who gets control of this territory here, Alsace-Lorraine. The last time that it changed hands, now it's changed hands, a few times, But the last time that it changed hands was by Germany in 1871. There was a war, specifically called the Franco-Prussian War. I'm never, ever, ever going to ask you about that. But Germany and France had been fighting over this territory. Germany takes it in 1871. So as of that point, it belongs to Germany. The last of the four big causes here is nationalism. Now, you've probably heard the term nationalism, or I bet you've heard this term patriotism before in the United States. And it's basically this idea that you have all of this devotion to your country's the best, you feel super strongly about it, and you're willing to do a lot of things to protect your country, or, basically just show your pride in your country. Now, at this time, there is propaganda that pops up pretty much, by nations all over Europe and in all parts of the world that are sort of showing this nationalistic attitude of, hey, our country's the best, everything's good for us, and we're good and everybody else is evil, that kind of a deal. So all four of these things combined sort of lay the framework for why there would be a situation that would even begin the First World War. All right? And so for the next couple minutes, I'm going to give you an idea of what exactly that spark is that sort of gets the war going. The spark starts with these two guys in the top left. In the very left, this guy, his name is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. All right? He is the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In a nutshell, he gets killed by this guy, Gavrilo Princip, who is from Serbia. Now you're like, okay, Mr. Bryans, why is this guy killing this guy, and what does it have to do with the entire world, and why does it matter, and why do I care? Well, to answer that, we got to look at this map. So, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, basically, everything that you see in red here, all of this territory was territory that was taken by the Austro-Hungarian Empire at some point. Okay? Remember, we talked about imperialism. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been growing. Now you can see Serbia way down here. You can notice here that this red Austro-Hungarian Empire, the territory, is slowly encroaching on Serbia. Okay? When it comes time for them to get into Sarajevo, which is the city where Franz Ferdinand is actually going to die, the city right here, Gavrilo Princip, this guy, is basically going to show a demonstration of, hey, we don't like the fact that your empire has been growing and growing and growing. We don't like imperialism. You know how we talked about that in the last unit, how not everybody really enjoys imperialism? Well, Gavrilo Princip and others like him, he doesn't really enjoy the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is encroaching on his land. So what he does is he basically comes out and assassinates, and you can see a little artist's depiction of that here. He comes out and he assassinates Franz Ferdinand. Now, mind you, Franz Ferdinand is not, the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's not even his son. He's actually his nephew. So this guy, Franz Ferdinand, his father, his name is Karl Ludwig. Karl Ludwig, his brother is Emperor Franz Joseph I of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you're like, dude, I don't have time for all this big family tree. What you need to know right this second is that this guy is not even the emperor. He's the emperor's nephew. And Gavrilo Princip is going to send a message. And that message is going to be, we don't like imperialism. I'm going to come into Sarajevo and I'm going to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. We're going to get in part 2 into a little bit more of what that assassination actually looks like and why it matters and why we go from this kind of a craziness to this kind of a craziness that brings all sort of different countries into this mess together, the United States included. All right, thanks for sticking with me, guys. Go ahead and click over to part 2.